Thank you all for coming. Hope this will be interesting. Um, I have a soft spot in my heart for Akoya because a lot of the things that we've done are really the sort of hopes and dreams that we had are actually being implemented at Akoya. So you'll see a lot of the similar sort of DNA there. So I'm going to share my screen here and use that to guide my presentation. And we'll do this for hopefully like 40 minutes or so, something like that. And then we'll have Q&A, okay? So everybody calls me Sandy. My real name's Alex, just Pentland at MIT. And I'm going to talk about the future of finance. As Wilson mentioned, this is related to the new book we're coming out, MIT Press, which is called Building the New Economy, Data as Capital. So the idea is that, money is clearly a means of production, so is labor, so is land, but data is now a fundamental means of production. And what we don't have is we don't have the sort of structure to be able to handle that, all the things that we have with money. Think of all the how complicated that structure is. We don't have any of that with data, and yet data is arguably at least as important. So there's lots of new business opportunities, and there's new business processes that will be needed to make that go. Akoya is doing some of them, but there's a whole sort of way of thinking about this stuff that I think is new. So a little bit about what we do. I have appointments in 3 places at MIT, the Media Lab, where we do research in what's called computational social science. It's thinking about how data can be used in a safe manner to do things like, predict GDP, to look at inequality, to look at where should you invest and things like that, but without endangering individual privacy or proprietary secrets of companies. And as part of that, I've been led discussions in the World Economic Forum that led to GDPR, the privacy regulation in Europe, and I'm on the board of the UN Sustainable Development Data and Metrics. I also am in the business school, Sloan, the Initiative for Digital Economy, where we think about the economics of data and AI, because AI is just patterns in data. You shouldn't really think of them as separate. And of course, the regulation that is driving a lot of the shaping of this area now. And then MIT's new College of Computing is sort of the home of connection science. And what we do is develop open source pre-standard software to help people put together the systems that are going to be compliant, useful, etc., to sort of lead the way. And the people who are part of this group produced Kerberos, which you might be familiar with. It does 85% of all the authentication in the world. We also led the discussion about OpenID Connect and Mobile ID, which are sort of de facto standards for ID. And then recently, we helped Switzerland spin up something that's a blockchain system for digital data. And it's not none of the mining stuff like Bitcoin. It uses IBM Hyperledger as an architecture. But what it lets you do is move not just money, but also digital ownership of things, medical data, all sorts of data in a way that's auditable, privacy preserving, etc. Akoya, of course, which we're proud to see you guys doing what you're doing, and have a lot of influence on the EU 2021 data regulations and auditing standards. And those are important because what those data regulations are forcing is more people to do things in the sort of manner that Akoya is starting to do. So the wind is at your back from a regulatory point of view. So the core problem, I think, is that what we have is we have an ecology where of data where people do not trust what's being done with the data, rightly, or AI. Remember, AI is just patterns in data. So who's using whose data to do what? Is it in my interest? Probably not. You have these big sort of mining rigs, Google, Facebook, etc. And people are upset. They want to control the data and they want to be trusted that what's happening with this sort of data is in their interest and that they're not being exploited. So the phrase I came up with is we need a new deal on data. This is the thing that drove creation of GDPR, and you can look it up on the web. There's a paper about it back in the early aughts, 2000s, that drove the GDPR discussion. And the core idea here is that you should think of capital a little bit like you think, data a little bit like you think of money or labor or land. It's a means of production. It needs to have ownership. It needs to have all of control, auditing, all of the things that we have for these other major sources of wealth in our society. And currently, as we talked about, there's a few companies that seem to own and dominate the whole territory. And I like this quote from Piketty, who's the sort of champion of economy on the left. And what he says is large returns to capital is not bad in itself. So people mistake this about his work. They say, oh, returns to capital is bad. Well, no, the problem is the capital is just in too few hands. Exactly the same with data. The data is in too few hands. How can we democratize it? How can we put that power in a more diverse set of stakeholders and get the benefit of that and have that flow to all corners of society? And so what that's going to require, just as it does with money and land and labor, is new institutions. The first grounding is digital identity and ownership. And of course, that's what GDPR started to do in the new California laws. And I think that we'll see that in this country. We're seeing it around the world. And things are beginning to roll out. And we help a lot of different people like MasterCard and many other sort of governments deploy these digital identity mechanisms, which can result in less cybercrime, much cheaper know your customer, and better anti-laundering sorts of things. One of the things that a system should have is auditability and accountability. So currently, you don't know what happens to your data. You don't know where it is. You don't know what it is. And its use is not being audited. And we have an approach that we think gives you continuous full auditability and accountability. And I think that's what we see that the regulators are beginning to ask for as they realize that this is now possible. And I'll show you how to do that. And of course, there need to be a criminal system. There need to be penalties for screwing up. And we have this in the form of banks and other sorts of institutions for dollars. And what we need to do is we need to have the equivalent thing in terms of data. And interestingly, the EU 2021 data regulations specify that data flows should be through things like data banks, where the actual data is not shared, it's insights on data, and they're shared in a fiduciary responsible manner that respects the rights and permissions of the data owners. So that's really interesting that there's this change that's happening where data is suddenly, you need to begin thinking about it the way you would handle money. Right? So what would live in a data bank? Well, here's an illustration of a sort of thing that we're helping people set up. And it doesn't need to have a lot of personal data, although it's really good to have it be a repository for people's personal data so that they have someplace to keep their data, to keep a copy of their data, which is required under a lot of these new regulations. But then to produce advantage to people, to make use of that data, you don't want to share the individual data. And it turns out what you can do is you can look at things that are like census data off of this individual data. So the bank, just like it takes individual banking accounts and aggregates those to loans, can take individual data, which it holds for the people, doesn't sell that, doesn't give it away, but what it does, it produces insights. And the sorts of insights it can do are things like where the community works, where it shops, where it plays, other sorts of statistics that are really like census statistics. So those have no sort of personal identifiable data in it. And it's really interesting because it turns out that those are the sort of insights that are safe to share, and they're incredibly powerful. So we've been able to show, for instance, that you can predict on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis year-on-year growth of value of the economy in that neighborhood, wages, stores, things like that, using just that data. So no personal data. It's built on personal data, but the part that's shared and used is this aggregate. And in fact, it's an extremely strong relationship. So the diversity of stores and people predicts year-on-year growth with more than 50% of the variance accounted for. And if you know anything about sort of economic predictions, that should sort of stun you, is that independent of education, investment, regulation, things like that, this diversity in cities across the whole world predicts economic growth. And we can even do it at the individual level. So we can say things like, if you put a store here, based on this flow of people and diversity of stores, this is what you can expect the sales of that new store to be. And we can do that as well as people can do that for existing stores, which is phenomenal. Right? You can actually guide investment to increase the GDP of neighborhoods. So in today's world, where we have a lot of inequality, we have a lot of neighborhoods that have been slammed by the pandemic, we can now use their data, or more properly, they can use their data to guide reconstruction and investment. And they can do it in a way that's extremely accurate, much more than you would have before. And there's an early example at that website. You can also do a variety of other things. You can identify pockets of poverty or inequality. You can guide development of transportation infrastructure, public health. That's a big thing in the pandemic. Do you know how good your neighborhood is in terms of public health? That's a huge risk factor for COVID. And basically nobody knows because it's not published. It's not published very often. But with this sort of neighborhood-owned data, you can begin doing this. So, of course, the big guys, the investment firms, would like to get into these sorts of economic reconstruction and investment because it looks like, and we believe is, a really good type of investment, which is hard to come by today, actually. And what we're doing is we're working with many of the credit unions and cooperatives in America. So, Enrica, you've never heard of. They built 56% of the US electrical grid. These are co-ops, not big companies, that collected money from customers and built the electric grid. Now, that was 30, 40, 50 years ago, but now they're beginning to use this sort of data resources of their members to be able to guide these hundreds of billions of dollars, literally hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. Similarly, the Credit Union National Association, there are hundreds, almost 1,000 credit unions that have a sort of social purpose, and they're in neighborhoods that need help, and they're beginning to use this sort of data of their neighborhoods to help the neighborhood, help investment in the neighborhood. And it hasn't gone without notice by the big banks. So the big banks have the sense that they have all these outlets, all these branches, which basically are irrelevant and are an albatross, investment albatross around their neck. And if they can repurpose them to help local investment, that is a great way of having new sort of revenue, of new relevance, It's a new line of business. And so they're beginning to work with some of these cooperatives to be able to do that. So we're very excited about that. These sorts of new businesses require new business processes. So um, the, remember that the core things are you have to fit within the same sort of regulations that you see with money and apply those to data. So ownership rights for personal data, informed consent, not the EULAs that you see today. Those are going to go away eventually. And continuous audit. So what you see today is that the vast majority of value in companies is their data. And auditing standards are changing, that those will now be on the books, they will be audited. And the idea of having continuous audit becomes more important because data can move so quickly. So that is something that's coming. And there is a tendency that people have to say, oh, well, let's take all the data and stick it in one spot. But as you guys in particular know, that's a bad solution. And we've been advocating what we call open algorithms, which is a federated data approach that you use. So instead of moving data to the code, you move the code to the data. That way you don't have to share individual data. You have this sort of sharing of insights or portions of insight to be able to do things. And what's interesting is that many industries are beginning to do this. And in the EU, this is now the preferred way of creating data sharing of any sort. And we have a nice paper showing that the economics of this are startling because it really opens up the economics of data sharing and has the ability to really rev up the economy in a way that's very safe with respect to individual rights. This is something that is a complete amazing thing to many people, but probably not to this audience, which is instead of putting all the data in one place, what I do is I have with my lawyers an agreement, a trust agreement among participants that they will answer certain questions using their data behind their firewall. So I send people a question, they record that, they run it on their data, they post the answer on a shared ledger. Now, a shared ledger is often a blockchain, but people react poorly to the word blockchain, so we don't call it a blockchain anymore. But the point is the data does not leave the place that it was originally collected. And this will be familiar to you, but we've also helped a number of other people do it. One of the startling things, other than it being safer in various ways, is that the legal costs are dramatically less. If I go to your corporate lawyer and say, hey, will Akoya give me all their data? The answer is no. Are you kidding? We don't know what you're going to do with it. We don't know what the liability is. But if I say, would you answer certain questions, and I'll pay you this amount for that, they'll say, well, let's think about that. And it becomes much easier to build data sharing agreements once you have this trust framework. So you're an example of this. Intuit is an example of this, which is, so we helped Intuit, and we're helping the EU official statistics group do this also, as well as others. A way to think about how this would work in consumer things is it's a little bit like credit cards, where I try to make a purchase, I display a code, which can be a one-time code. The identity provider transmits that to the bank, who then verifies it or not, and that goes then to the merchant. But the user's data is never available to the merchant. You can do this in a way where everything stays completely safe. Even the identity provider doesn't necessarily know any of the things that are happening. It can all be encrypted as long as the routing is okay. And that's, of course, what MasterCard and Visa do. And you can begin doing this with other data. Like, for instance, we're going to see immunity passports for COVID. We're going to see who's had the shots and who hasn't had the shots. And rather than making a national database, which is just a privacy nightmare, you can do this very much like you do credit cards. I show you my ID, you verify that with the local clinic where I got my shot, and now you know if you're an airplane or whatever, that I'm safe to go. And this is being required under data sharing rules for the EU. So if you take this sort of the next step further, you say, well, why am I building bespoke things for each type of data? That's crazy. And we have an architecture we call TradeCoin that we developed for this. And most recently, we helped Switzerland spin up something called Swiss Trust Chain. So it's a little like Akoya, but it's on a blockchain. It's a Hyperledger blockchain, and it's for all types of data. So this is Swiss Post and Swisscom, and now we're doing this also with their SIX, which is the large financial institution in there. And what it gives you is many of the things that are good about Akoya, but it takes it further because it's all sorts of data. It gives you continuous auditability. It gives you a higher level of security because it's all encrypted. And similarly, Singapore and their sovereign wealth fund are doing the same thing. Look up Project UBEN, and we're helping them as well. And one of the main things is this notion of continuous auditability. What that does is that lets you detect fraud or attack almost immediately because you have all the patterns of data immediately available. You can't see what the data is, but you do have these patterns available in encrypted form, and you can detect variations that are worrisome almost immediately. And you can look that people are sharing data the way they agreed to and not doing things that are illegal. And good guess, this will be required under the new auditing standards that are coming out in the US, but also worldwide. And one of there's things, of course, that have to change to make this happen. For instance, you have to be able to do what's called federated learning instead of sort of standard AI. But this is a huge growth area. It's part of all the AI open source things now. There's a variety of things that do it. It happens in your day-to-day life. Your phones use this. They don't share data often. What they do is they do local analysis and then send encrypted things back home. Nobody can ever see your personal data, but you can optimize the system as a whole. So you need to have your machine learning be a little different. Importance is you can learn from data that you don't own. And even if some of it is corrupted, these are very tolerant to bad data, which is a huge thing. So swipe on your phone. Endor is a company that spun off of our group that does this for various countries, as well as MasterCard and people like that. And I'll just end there. So Building the New Economy is the new book we have. It talks about all these sorts of data cooperatives, ways of handling data, the sort of new generalization of the economy to include data, and a lot of the ramifications of that. So let me just